Hello everybody, my name is Luke Marr and this is HauteLeMode, and today on HauteLeMode, if you couldn't tell from my t-shirt, we are going to be reacting to a fashion show that in reality recently has blown up on TikTok. It's become viral. It's being called the Prada Villains Show, but to the fashion inclined, it is actually Prada's Fall 2012 menswear collection. Now the thing is, when I saw it go viral on TikTok and I saw everybody saying like it's a Prada villain show, Prada villains, and they had all these actors in it and it was really bad and terrible, not the clothes, but like the whole vibe and aesthetic is meant to be scary and dystopian and all this. I was like, oh, I never really looked at the show, but as I started to look more and more into it, I was like, oh, we can make this a video. But instead of doing that whole breaking down each look in a whole sort of scripty manner, we're rather going to react to the video because it's just an easier way of us getting that content up and out in a timely fashion. I've also done all the research to make sure that we're giving you full, important, understanding context of the collection as well. So buckle up, buttercups, because we are going to be breaking down this whole show. I'm very excited. I'm very pumped. And it's going to be a moment. I want to talk about the whole setting of the show because it's very, very important. First things first, for context, if you do not know, Prada holds all of their shows, usually, historically, in the Fondazione Prada, which is essentially a headquarters sort of artistic space and kind of campus that Prada has in Milan. And what they do every single season is they transform the show space into this amazing, all-encompassing set. Now, the set design is usually a collaboration between Prada and Oma, which is essentially the collective of architects and interior designers, which is usually also attributed to a lot of Rem Koolhaas's work too. There's a whole sort of collective of Rem and then a bunch of other artists. Every season they transform this space. It's really amazing. You get to go in, and we'll talk about it in a bit as well, but the men's show and the women's show usually correlate. So far we're seeing a red, black, and white carpet, and Amo has described this as essentially a geometric flower motif, and it's done in this moquette carpet, which is a certain way of creating carpets through different pile lengths. And pile is essentially how plush a piece of carpet or upholstery can be. But there's actually pictures of them building the set, and you can see that each of the kind of squares is actually placed separately rather than it just being one big long rug. As for the inspiration, I'm pretty positive it's Art Deco inspired, and there's a couple of things that lead me to believe that. One is the fact that those sort of chandeliers are actually all glass rods, and they're made up of each of these little glass rods, which was usually attributed to the 1930s and the Art Deco movement. And I've actually found some Italian versions. They're more sconces than chandeliers, but they have this composition of glass rods with light moving through them, and that's kind of how it all comes together. So I assume that's kind of what's going on here. Now, as for the actual inspiration for the rugs, it's a lot harder to figure out. I promise you, I've probably spent 3 hours dedicating my life to looking at rugs online and in books. And I found a couple of different inspirations. One is that it possibly is a reference to Eastern European hotel lobbies. I'm not sure exactly how relevant that one is, but we'll get into that theory a little bit because I feel like it has something to do with the Grand Budapest Hotel and that whole aesthetic. From that idea of the Grand Budapest Hotel, there was this kind of idea maybe that it was part of the Jungstilled movement, which was a German and Austrian take on Art Nouveau, but it doesn't really line up to me with the geometric element, so I'm not really sure of that. Another that I really thought maybe possibly was a thing is the Ganado rugs, or Ganado, I'm not really sure, but they are essentially a style of Native American rugs that came up, I believe, in the late 1800s when this sort of color red came into effect, and they usually have a red, black, white, and maybe sometimes gray as well, coloring throughout them, and you can find them in the 1920s and 1930s with similar geometric shapes. And we'll talk about this later again. I feel like there might possibly be some inspiration there. But the other thing, too, that I was thinking maybe is Miuccia Prada loves a kind of David Hicks reference. David Hicks, if you don't know, was the interior designer and architect from the 1960s and 1970s. If you haven't ever seen Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, that iconic carpet that Danny sort of rides his little tricycle around in, that's a David Hicks carpet. And Miuccia Prada loves a David Hicks reference, and we'll talk a lot about spring 1996 and fall 1996 Prada collections too, and how that all sort of plays in and layers into this collection as well. And finally, another element of this Eastern European inspiration could be the fact that Turkmenistan actually creates rugs, or had created rugs around the same time as the 1920s and 1930s that had the same colors and geometric figures as well. get into more of that later too. So that's kind of my thoughts on the inspiration. I feel like it's heavily Art Deco inspired, and there's a bunch of other sort of references that might possibly have been collaged together to create this one-of-one sort of geometric motif and style. So let's watch. First look, it's really heavy on tailoring. As we can see, it's this black multi-layer suit. And a lot of this collection really does sort of date back to the 1930s, not only in set design, but also in terms of referencing tailoring of the period. I want to talk about that high white turtleneck collar thing. That's actually called a stock, and it's from the 18th and 19th centuries, and it was what men sort of used to create this high neck effect. And we see it here referenced over and over again. But I like the fact that it's done rather in a turtleneck rather than a sort of silky white band of fabric. Now, King George IV actually was the guy to make this style popular, and then later on it would be seen as a sign of a dandy, a man that loved fashion and style. I'm also wondering if there's a reference to the peg top trouser here. Most of the pants in this collection actually have a front crease throughout them, and they aren't cuffed, which we can see here. Now, that actually does date back to the 1830s, but was refashioned to become popular again in the early 1900s. And I know I keep saying the 1930s is probably a main reference, but you can see that there is a continuation of referencing different periods of menswear throughout the 19th and 20th centuries coming together in the collection and morphing and collaging, which in reality is very Prada. We can also see that on these shoes, there are actual sort of sole protectors or sort of rubber protectors for the loafer. I find them really, really interesting. Some of them are a little bit more colorful than others. Their shoe has always been very important to them. So it's cool to see. Hot, sexy. I love this. Now this is a little sort of blazer jacket style, I think double-breasted. It's pretty positive that this jacket is inspired by the sack suit. Now the sack jacket was popular during the 1860s, like this single-breasted style, but actually did come back again in the 1930s. It was adapted to become called the Palm Beach suit, and it had a sort of band at the back that would nip in the waist, which was similar to women's wear styles of that period as well. Usually if you look at women from the 1930s and 1940s, they very sort of nipped in waists, like this man right here, and a sharp sort of shoulder. There isn't really a padded shoulder situation going on here, but we can see that this waist really does sort of taper. And I bring this all up because a lot of this collection also spoke about the idea of playing with different gender ideas that normally wouldn't be associated with men. In the actual collection show notes, it does verbatim say that the collection is trying to subvert male archetypes and formal codes of dress. What I also think is really, really intriguing is that Prada, for their 2012 film, which they do films often as a way to build in this whole stratosphere or atmosphere of artistic expression, they did a film called Therapy. And in Therapy, Helena Bonham Carter plays this really, really rich woman who wears this really beautiful, fabulous Prada outfit and this purple fur coat. Sir Ben Kingsley actually plays her therapist, and he's therapizing her, or so it seems. But while she's talking and not paying attention and laying down on the couch and sort of saying, "Therapist, this is what's happening to me in my life, and my daddy, and my father, and my mother," Sir Ben Kingsley literally cannot control himself and sees her Prada coat, and he's like, "Oh my god, I love this." And so he gets up and he moves, and he sees the coat, and then he like touches it and like rubs it on his face, and then he puts it on. And then on the screen, it literally reads, "Prada suits everyone." And it's this idea of, again, gender bending, gender stereotypes being broken, subverting male archetypes, etc., etc. I wonder if that's kind of what is happening here really, really subtly. The reference to the sack suit and the sack jacket, but also played into this whole idea and notion of the Palm Beach suit too. So as the suits are walking, we can also see that they kind of fit almost like this very sort of muscular male physique at certain points, which I think is really intriguing. It's a little bit more sort of muscly than your normal, much more slimmer menswear model. I also was wondering if there was this idea of fitting the garments to be much more fitted, almost to show this idea of the male physique, much more brawny, muscly, almost six-packy, big pectoral muscle aesthetic that came around in the early 2010s. And now I know this part is going to sound crazy, but I also wonder if maybe this influence of like Jersey Shore and like Mike the Situation and Pauly D pulling up your abs and really sort of being into your physical body and your spray tan and your muscles and this male macho-ness and the advent of Instagram and men showing off their body for the female gaze as well as the male gaze. I wonder if that all played into the fit of these suits and why they fit the way that they do. I know that might sound crazy that I'm putting Mike the Situation and Miuccia Prada together in a theory, but the one thing I'm going to say about Mrs. Prada, she understands the zeitgeist at all times. So I would be intrigued. You can see that this is a double-breasted jacket, right? Now, one thing that Miuccia Prada loves is reefer. And I don't mean that in the Nancy Grace manner. I mean that in the sense of she loves a reefer jacket. Here's the thing. The reefer jacket is essentially the pea coat, but was worn by Navy officers. And usually it had little epaulettes and it had little buttons that had actual anchors like embossed into them. And they were only really worn by men of certain power and status within the Navy. A big talking point from Prada regarding this collection isn't really the whole idea of villains, but rather this whole idea of power and exuding this power through the dress, which could be a reference to tailoring and men's power throughout history. And so I wonder if this idea of taking the reefer jacket, which was only for powerful men and men of status in the Navy, and bringing that into a suiting style rather than just referencing a peacoat, might possibly be what Mrs. Prada is going for. I also just love the gray on gray. Now, next up, we can see here, the trench coat is happening underneath this coat. Trench coats, again, play into this idea of military dress and military styles and military power. Now, I stop us again because this trench coat, in reality, is actually a reference back to the 1850s again. Menswear, tailoring, referencing. Now, trench coats were actually invented by the brand Aquascutum, which is a British heritage brand, which created these waterproof men's coats that could be wrapped. Because usually, if you were a man living in England of the upper classes, whether it was aristocracy or royalty or just being wealthy, you wanted a coat that would stop the cold and rain, which is just British in nature, from making you cold. And so over time, really rich British men started to wear trench coats because that became the fashionable thing to do. Eventually, Thomas Burberry would create his own take on the trench coat, and he would make it out of gabardine, which would help to sort of reflect the water even more. But by the time that the 1910s came around and World War I happened, the trench coat got its name because men would wear it in the trenches because the trenches were wet and cold and gross and disgusting and scary. This idea of status within society, wealth, and power seemed to be more and more coming together through the trench coat. I want to stop here because this shirt is really intriguing. Doesn't that sort of waistband look very different than the rest of the flowiness and sort of wrinkliness of the shirt? Yes, it does. Now, I'm wondering if this is a reference to a cummerbund, which is that pleated little piece that would be worn with men's suiting. But normally cummerbund is pleated in the front and you can't really see any buttons on it. But what I wonder is if this is maybe a reference to the waistcoat. During the 1930s, the waistcoat actually did have buttons on it and it was quite low. It almost sort of helped, again, taper in the waist. So I wonder if this is Miuccia Prada sort of creating this idea of the cummerbund, or something that came around in the early 1900s called the Camara band, which was kind of like a cummerbund. It just had buttons in the front, and sort of recontextualizing the male body, again, at the waist through this notion. I really love them. I think they're really, really intriguing. I haven't found any vintage ones online, otherwise I'd probably buy one if it fit, but they're really lovely. We're also seeing pinstripes are coming in here, and again, you're seeing a double-breasted version of this Camara cummerbund waistcoat thing. It's really strange, but I'm also kind of obsessed, and it's Miuccia Prada, again, recontextualizing and remodernizing these historical men's tailoring pieces that have been lost to time to a degree. We're seeing more of these sort of trench coats come around. This one seems to have no sleeves, so it's kind of like a vest. And then we have a pinstripe one again, but this is sort of a wool and yellow style. I love it. I thought it was corduroy at first, but it's not. We're also seeing something that happened during the 1930s a lot too, is men would wear sort of pinstripe styles or different colors that didn't actually always go with what they were wearing in more casual fashions. So you see a red with a gray or a black with a gray, and they might not all line up perfectly, but that's kind of the style that was there as well. I also just love the red. I love the way that she combines colors too. It always makes me laugh. And here I think is our final little pinstripe, but again, even those pinstripes are different. They're all pinstriping, but they're very, very strange. Even the red shirt underneath, I didn't see that before. So this is kind of where the collection changes. We go away from just solely seeing these pinstripes, and now we're starting to see prints. And look at these layered prints. That coat itself is very David Hicks inspired. Like, look at the Stanley Kubrick rug from The Shining by David Hicks, and then look at this coat. One might not be as poppy and 60s as the other, but it's certainly this symmetrical, colorful, sort of strange motif. If we look at Prada's Spring 1996 collection, titled the infamous Ugly Chic collection, Miuccia Prada for the first time really references these kind of ugly motifs and does them in colors that don't really always work together. Miuccia Prada also was somebody that grew up in the 60s and saw the 60s unfold, and I have a feeling that, considering she loves the 60s, she probably was looking at David Hicks's work, because this British aristocrat actually became the interior designer to many of the chic shishi people in London. I love when Miuccia references a reference of herself, but also references a sort of artistic different reference as well. It's really cool. I love seeing it. And again, the layering of all these different motifs and prints, something only she can do so well. Now, next up, I'm really excited for these because I love them. They're these beautiful printed coats as well. They're really, really lovely. The print isn't really super visible from afar, but see, when we zoom in, we can see it much more. It's not really 60s symmetrical, but at the same time, it definitely has a continuation. It's minimized. And as we move up, we can see again this reference. We can see firstly that there is a gun shirt that this man is wearing. Those are guns in black and white. This idea of Prada villains and this idea of power is definitely there. But the other thing that I think is really intriguing, and it's where the reference to the rug also comes in, is this Astrakhan collar. Now, Astrakhan, if you do not know, is from the Karakul lamb. And what happens is the lamb, when it's really young, gets killed, and they actually create the Astrakhan fur out of that. I know, sad, bad, terrible. But at the same time, it's also what the people of Turkestan have been doing for a very long time. So like, I'm not going to be the one to drag them for their cultural experiences. But Astrakhan historically has always been a really high, luxurious fur and fabric. Karakul lambs only grow in certain regions of Turkestan, and so in reality they're very valuable and very rare. So we can see this idea of Turkestan coming into the collection through fabric. But again, if we look at the carpet, you can see from the 20s and the 30s Turkestani rugs that actually look very similar and utilize very similar color aesthetics to the rugs that are on here. And Turkestan, in reality, is kind of in Eastern Europe, also, I would say, technically Western Asia as well, blends this idea of the Eastern European aesthetics, hotel lobbies, and all of that coming together. Again, this man is also wearing a gun shirt, and like, I just love. It builds into this power aesthetic, it builds into this villain, and also the way that they cast it. Like, this man could star alongside William Dafoe, and I would also be terrified of him. And we'll talk more about Mr. Dafoe soon. But I love that coat. It's beautiful. So this motif, I couldn't really get a good up-close picture of it, but what I could get is a vintage style that I found on the RealReal. So here's the thing about this shirt. When we look at it up close, we can actually see that it has 4 different portraits in a sort of diamond motif. Each of these portraits are kind of silhouettes of sort, where we can see the side profile of someone's face. Now, one of them is what looks to be some sort of Greco or Roman soldier, somebody that you would not really want to be, sparring against in any kind of powerful situation where one had to exert their power on the other. Another intriguing element is you see a Viking, with the big Norse sort of headgear and the big long braids that come down the side. Again, not somebody I really wanted to hang out with. They're very powerful. They're very scary. They traumatized a lot of people all over Europe. Another intriguing one is this sort of top hat style that a man is wearing, and then he has these sort of goggles on and a little bow tie. Now, a lot of this collection actually was referred to as kind of steampunk, Prada going steampunk, which is an aesthetic that came around in the 1900s. It's this sort of futuristic but dystopian take on the Gilded Age and things like that. The aesthetics are usually sort of very tailored, gentlemanly suits and those kind of moments. Mustaches like we're seeing here and also on the picture, top hats, and certain circular goggles. It's this kind of old school Victorian, but made a little bit futuristic and punky. So that's intriguing and something that comes up a lot in this collection too. And the final one that I found really, really interesting was the silhouette of a Native American. Somebody that looks to me like a Native American warrior due to the fact that they have feathers in their hair. A lot of Native American nations actually believe that if you were a warrior and you fought well or won a battle, that you would get a feather that came down from maybe an eagle, a bird of that sort of distinction. It was essentially you kind of getting the energy of that beautiful animal that also held power and weight socially and had a sort of power to it. So I think that shirt that we're seeing is Miuccia Prada appreciating this idea and notion of power in different men throughout history and through different cultural lenses. And it also, again, maybe plays into how there is a reference to the ganado rugs of the Native American tribes, and how Miuccia Prada maybe wove that into the style, set design, and aesthetic of the rugs too, on top of it being a reference maybe to Turkestan and Turkestani rugs. Here we have this little brown suit, and it's something that, again, I find really, really intriguing, and again, a reference back to old Prada. The spring 1996 and fall 1996 collections, which spring 1996, ugly chic, you know, this idea of color combination, ugly sort of motifs that are seen as gross and disgusting, but could be seen also as aesthetically pleasing to other people. But fall 1996 essentially was like the sister collection to it. It further explored that idea and that notion. And what it did was showcased a lot of different colors that normally wouldn't be seen together and seen combined, like brown and purple, or yellows that almost were brownish and purple. It's really intriguing, again, to see that color aesthetic of an iconic collection sort of brought back into the menswear styles. And again, if we're thinking about this idea of blurring gender stereotypes, well, you're referencing a women's wear collection to make a menswear collection. There are these different colored lapels, which isn't something that I've seen really from menswear throughout time and history. Look, again, you have red with purple and black, all these colors sort of blending together. And something else that really happened, I think, in the 1930s too, is there was this backlash against men being boring in the way that they dressed. People were like, ugh, men, blah, disgusting. Who wants boring men to dress boringly? So what they wanted was a little bit more aestheticism, and also coming out of World War I and before going into World War II, there was this idea of like rejuvenation and a renaissance of sorts of culture, bringing us to the Roaring Twenties and the Jazz Age and things like that. Here we can see again black revisited. It's this black trench coat paired with different little pinstripes. There's purple in with gray, you know, the black turtleneck distinction. This is a little bit more of a commercial section, I would say, for the collection, but it will come to pass, and it sort of leads us into the Prada villains aesthetic that we really want to get at. Pinstripes coming together, double-breasted styles, maybe references to reefer suits, trench coats, again, power, power, purple, 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 fall 1996, spring 1996, Ugly Chic Part 2, the remix. It's all in there, which I love that coat. It's a beautiful coat. Now here we have a moment. This, again, is this idea of the colors of the collar being different than the jacket. I mean, look at that jacket. It is beautiful. It is stunning. And here we have our first intriguing casting. This is Garrett Hedlund, who is an actor that many may know, because you all know that a model would never go like that, pointing down the runway. This has to be an actor. So here's the thing about this Prada villain aesthetic and Prada villain idea, is that this kind of comes together because a lot of the actors that were cast in the show personally by Mrs. Prada herself, she asked these actors, and for the record, not a singular one said no. So that's the power of Prada. This idea of the actors sort of coming in sort of again plays into this idea of power, but also these sort of scary men wearing these really sort of strict, rigid uniforms and clothing. And there was this whole talk about this sort of like phantom script that they all were kind of following. This idea that they were told something maybe backstage to sort of give this sort of aura and essence as they walked down the runway that would lead you to believe they were kind of scary, they were powerful, they were maybe like villains or evil sort of antagonists in a movie of some sort. I mean, also, as we open the show, we could hear the clicking of what seemed to be like an old school film, you know, camera. There's this idea of film sort of building in. And Garrett, he looks good. I also love the little waistcoat in silk underneath. It's very chic. It's very elegant. Now, I know that there was a lot of references to this idea of Prada villains, and all of these guys were playing villains, but also, for the most part, most of the actors cast at one point or another have played villains. Garrett Hedlund in 2007 actually did play a villain in the movie Death Sentence. So Garrett's character actually kills Kevin Bacon's character's son as like a gang initiation in this movie, and then Kevin Bacon kind of like hunts Garrett Hedlund down. So villain, bam, one for one, Prada's on it. You know what I mean? I also just love the silk sort of smoking coat underneath, this idea of the white collar, no tie. That's something we also see a lot throughout the collection, is this no tie notion. Now, next up is one of the Carroll brothers. Now, I believe that this is Alexandre. Now, Alexandre is a twin. He is a brother to Victor. They're identical twins. And silky jacket. That is probably a reference to smoking jackets, which came about in the 1800s and were adapted from the Middle East, but eventually became sort of part of men's attire for after dinner wear when they would all hang out together. Is if we look up close, we can actually see that the little embroidery, or I think it's a print because there's no way you could really embroider that well. Prada probably could, but you know, I think it would be easier to print, is those are actually three little swords, those little lines. If we look up really, really close, we can see that they're swords. So again, you have guns earlier, now you have swords. It's this idea of power and powerful objects, and those powerful objects can do harm and do things to people. It's really intriguing. I think it's really, really cool. But Alex and his brother Victor actually were in the Sherlock Holmes: A Game of Shadows, I think that's it, film, where they played characters, I think they were twins, that are assassins, or at like one point get like brainwashed to assassinate somebody. And so here again, this is Victor. Victor is wearing a purple smoking jacket, again white. Also, even just that idea of a sort of grid looking motif to me feels very 1996 Prada, but I might be like doing a little bit too much. I might be overstepping my bounds. Ooh, okay. Next up, again, different color. And we have a little sock moment. We can also see that these little black brogues actually have flowers on them. So again, you have this idea of men wearing flowers on their business shoes, playing on gender, playing on stereotypes of what men should wear. And to further play into that, he's wearing visible socks, right? Which normally isn't something that is done when you're a grown man. Historically, throughout time, young men, probably till they're like, what, 8, 9, 10, maybe tops, would actually wear kind of little day dresses. And then once they became like a man to people of what, the 20th, 19th, 18th century, they were then given trousers. They were given pants to wear because that signified now you are old enough to have responsibility as a man. So again, it's this idea of men's styling. And what Mrs. Prada has done is she's taken what I would consider like a chemise, which is a robe that would be worn underneath somebody's very fine silk clothing in times of yore, and turned it into almost like a short pant suit jacket, because this has buttons. I think it's double-breasted, this shirt, but it's still a cotton shirt. It's really intriguing. Again, she's remixing and remodernizing these styles. And here we can see it much more. It's shorts. So again, this idea of men not really yet growing into being men according to men's historical standards. And also this Kamara band sort of waistcoat jacket situation that's sucking everything in, but it's still also cut in the style of a suit jacket, but it's white cotton that would normally be associated with a button-down shirt. It's cool. It's a cool take. It's a cool way of playing on these things. And again, I'm pretty positive there are flowers on those shoes as well. There are. I see it. Now here, this beautiful white coat, I love it. It's stunning. It's gorgeous. And what I think is really, really intriguing is his red glasses. If you don't know, those red glasses are called Windsor glasses. They do have, according to this product collection, a bit of an adapted top bar. We can see them. They're kind of weird and quirky. I do feel like part of that plays into this whole idea of steampunk and the sort of goggles that are really big in steampunk. But the Windsor glass, which is kind of shifted, modernized, and moved here, have these red sort of tinted styles. Now, the Windsor glass, made pretty popular by none other than John Lennon. It's something that he wore all the time. But the other thing is, Woody Harrelson actually wore red tinted Windsor glasses in his film Natural Born Killers, where he plays a pretty much serial killer with his girlfriend, where they just murder people, but they're like glamorizing this idea of murder. They're like hot and sexy serial killers. Feels very American and also very dystopian, and also very much so in this sense, this kind of product collection where these people that we would see as villains who have this really sort of powerful thing, and we're all, and by all I mean at least right now, I am enraptured by a gun print shirt and a multi-sword print jacket. Also, just the white looks so chic and so elegant and so beautiful. And also, we want to talk about the John Lennon thing again. I mean, like, he got murdered by a gun. I don't know if that's a reference. Maybe the idea of, like, the guy that killed John Lennon being a villain and a horrible person, you know, all that plays into it. Next up, we have Jamie Bell. Now, Jamie Bell you probably know from the film Billy Elliot, but here he's grown up. Now, I couldn't find any, like, specific Jamie Bell villain scenarios, but there are two films that I guess you could say like he kind of is like an anti-hero, so it fits into the villain aesthetic. One is where he plays this guy called Dick Dandelion in Love, Wendy, and he's like a kind of, you know, sharp-shooting, gun-toting guy, so again, guns, notions. The other one is called HauteLeMode, where like I'm pretty positive his like mom dies and he starts to like sleep with this like stepmom or teacher or something, and then he kind of like is really creepy and like lusts after her, but I don't really, yeah, like again, anti-hero. I wouldn't call it villain per se, but I would definitely say anti-hero. And then Jamie Bell did go on to play villains later in his career after 2012, but again, we can see it. Again, you have these red glasses, you have this sort of Kamara band style, the full white, the turtleneck. I love the black pant. It's very chic, very elegant, very lovely. He's giving scary. He's giving pew pew murder. Next up, we have Emile Hirsch. Now, Emile Hirsch, I didn't really know, to be completely honest, but he is an actor, and he actually played a villain in the film Alpha Dog. Now, here we can see Emile's look is made up of this black double-breasted coat, the white collar, all of that sort of jazz. But in the movie Alpha Dog, Emile Hirsch does play this guy named Johnny Truelove, who is actually based on this guy named Jesse James Hollywood, who was a real-life drug dealer who essentially had somebody that was his customer, who was this guy that was a drug dealer, and when one of his customers didn't pay, Jesse James Hollywood had his client's brother, who was innocent, picked up and then kidnapped and held for ransom, and then ordered for the kid to be murdered. Emile Hirsch, by this point, definitely played a villain, definitely has had the experience of it. And so it's intriguing again to sort of see him here. We're Prada villaining. I feel like we're at least 4 for 5. And now we have Tim Roth, iconic villain, scary, dastardly man that he is, wearing a sack jacket, a little vest underneath, black pant, you know, all the jazz, all the fixins of menswear aesthetics. The first Tim Roth movie that he actually did that was him being a villain is called Made in Britain, and he literally has a swastika tattooed literally in between his eyebrows. And it's about this idea of the 1980s and the UK and people growing up and all those sorts of things. Not really growing up if you're a Nazi, but you get what I'm saying. But then he was also villains in a bunch of other movies too. General Thade, he played a scary gorilla man who was in Planet of the Apes. Archibald Cunningham in Rob Roy, and the Abomination in The Incredible Hulk. So Tim Roth, he's done his Prada villain. I'm also intrigued by the tailoring of the look for him. It's different. It's a little bit understanding that he's a shorter man, a shorter gentleman. It looks really good. It works really, really well. He has the swagger to him as he walks. It's intriguing. Next up, legend, Willem Dafoe. Very excited to talk about Willem, because this one's really, really cool, and we're also rounding out the end of the collection, essentially. So let's name off some of Willem Dafoe's iconic roles. I mean, Green Goblin, Max Schreck, and Bobby Peru are all ones that we've probably known about. I mean, if you've ever watched American Psycho, Detective Kimball, terrifying, even though he's also like supposed to be kind of a good guy in the movie. I'm just like, I always creeped out by him, and like I wanted that man to get caught the entirety of American Psycho. So it's really intriguing that Willem Dafoe can do that. But what I find really intriguing is we can see that this black, beautiful overcoat, a sort of frock coat style, but underneath that is a trench coat, right? It's this double-breasted trench coat. This product collection was shown in January of 2012. The Grand Budapest Hotel did not start filming until January of 2013. And if you look at that movie, not only did Prada actually do luggage design for the film, because in reality Prada historically is a luggage brand that was very popular in Milan and then became popular throughout the rest of Europe with the powerful, wealthy, and aristocratic classes. But the other thing that's intriguing about the movie is Willem Dafoe's character, who's called J.G. Jopling, actually does wear a black leather trench coat that's usually belted in the movie, and guess what? He's literally a hitman. The other thing is, Wes Anderson, who directed Grand Budapest Hotel, actually created a cafe with Prada in and on the Fondazione Prada called Cafe Luce, I believe. So this idea of Wes Anderson and Miuccia Prada sort of collaborating is not a weird thing. There's kind of like this push and pull throughout this collection between the two of them, which I think is really, really intriguing. I know that Wes Anderson didn't just like copy Miuccia Prada, because obviously they would have had to be working on the aesthetics of that film for quite some time, but it's just so weird that like creatives lining up, doing the same sort of aesthetics about a year away from each other is really cool and intriguing and wonderful. And I wonder if there is that inspiration that came from this collection too. It's just sweet. And Willem Dafoe, is terrifying. He's so scary, but he's so good, and we love him. We really stand this man. He's an icon. And next up, we have Adrien Brody. Now, Adrien Brody is wearing this beautiful Astrakhan collar and lapel style jacket. It has that red motif. We can see that that motif that we saw earlier in these kind of coats is definitely there. It's just in this sort of like blood red. It's terrifying, but it's also so beautiful you can't look away. Now, Adrien Brody, I feel like everybody loves, and also he's the only person that's actually wearing those red glasses the entire time. Everybody else has these sort of big pins and buttons and brooches, which I think is really intriguing. Not only probably references military dress and garb, but might also reference brooches, which brooches are much more sort of women's things. It's this idea of that. But military pins are men's brooches, essentially, in my opinion. So I wonder if that is an idea of blending gender stereotypes as well in the collection. But on top of everything I just talked about with Willem Dafoe, Adrien Brody is the other villain in the Grand Budapest Hotel. And Adrien Brody plays this guy, Dimitri, whose mother essentially leaves the whole estate, I think, to manager Gustav. So Dimitri's like, Willem Dafoe, go kill him. Sorry, I'm like ruining the movie. I apologize, but it's what happens. So essentially, Adrien Brody, again, also would have filmed this movie starting a year ago. So I wonder if this is like the way that Wes Anderson was seeing, like, can these men play villains for me? And I mean, like, Willem Dafoe, you don't really need to ask whether he can play a villain. But this idea of the villains is coming through. These men are all and have all played villains. It's really cool. Adrien Brody's beautiful Astrakhan, it's stunning, and the gray with the black and the red, again, I wonder if that maybe is a reference to the Ganado rugs, or possibly the Turkestan rugs too. It's really intriguing, really cool to me, and like, chic. Also, I'm dying because he literally stops. He's like, and I'm like, Mama, it's not a 90s catwalk, but like, I'm happy that you think it is, because you deserve the world. And this finale look that we're gonna see is none other than Gary Oldman. Prada villain, numero uno. I'm sorry. He's serving, he's terrifying, I love it. Now for me, my Gary Oldman introduction was none other than Sirius Black in the Harry Potter movies, first in Prisoner of Azkaban, but then also in Goblet of Fire and The Order of Phoenix. And it's so funny to me, as I was looking at Sirius Black, just because I was like, oh, you know, he's not really a villain. He's seen as a villain in the first movie that we see of Harry Potter, but he's really not. He's really a great guy, and we love Sirius Black. But Sirius Black's whole aesthetic is literally the pinstripes and all of these looks and vibes from this show. And so now I'm like, is Mitra Prada not only watching Jersey Shore, but is she also watching, living, laughing, and loving Harry Potter? Is she a Harry Potter stan? I need to know. Literally, you can see colors that line up with this collection, pinstripes, this idea of like pocket watches, and this sort of steampunk, old world, Victorian, Edwardian tailoring in Sirius Black's wardrobe. And Gary Oldman is now here closing out the show. There are some other movies that Gary Oldman did where he actually played true full-out villains. One of them is Zorg in The Fifth Element, another is Mason Verger in Hannibal, and Dracula in Bram Stoker's Dracula. And I will say that the Dracula look that he wears is really truly .com. Again, very lining up with this old Victorian, Edwardian aesthetic. It almost looks like something he would wear. And then Dracula eventually like comes out in this like big flashy red robe, and he's serving. It's intriguing to me. So I love this idea of Gary Oldman coming in and serving it up to the girls. He looks scary. He looks terrifying. He knows he has a character to do, and he's stopping, which I love. They're like, oh, we're not supposed to stop? I'm confused. And like, look at his little menacing walk. It's creepy, and I love it. And he looks like he's a man on a mission. And he might, you know, possibly cough on the runway and somehow shoot a little dart into somebody sitting on the front row who happens to be an ambassador to a small Eastern European country that we've never heard of, for political gain and monetarily gain as well. I love it. It's a great collection. It's really cool. The references in it are super wonderful. And now here's everybody coming out towards the end. It's wonderful. It's sweet. It's chic. It's elegant. Adrien Brody takes off his sunnies. He's like, all right, I'm done now. Garrett Hedlund is very tall and also really sort of moving the body, which is also not something that is normal in fashion shows. Like, you go to fashion shows, and if you move out of what you're supposed to move out of, you don't get recast. So the fact that they're all stopping and then everybody's like, wait, what's going on, is also making me laugh. I love it. It's super chic. I also love the fact that the Carroll twins are walking together. It's great. It's a really, really good show. And I just want to wait to see Mrs. Prada, because we love her. Show me the queen. There she is. Yeah, my legend. Look at her in her wrinkled skirt. I love her. She's the best. What a star. So that is the Prada Villains collection. It's crazy, it's wild, it's weird, it's wacky, but it's filled with all these really cool references. So I hope you guys enjoy it. I hope you really did. Like, this is something that I've been working on, and I want to do more videos like this where we look at fashion shows just in a reaction format rather than full scripted experiences, you know what I mean? So let me know if there are any collections that you really want me to talk about and look at going forward, and I will definitely put them on my list, and we will get on it. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I will see you guys in the next video, and TTYL.